Imagine this. It's a bright Saturday afternoon. You're out shopping, minding your own business, simply enjoying a rare day off. The last thing on your mind is trouble. But in a single moment, everything changes. Not because of what you did, not because of who you are, but because of how someone else chooses to see you. Major General Sarah Miller had spent over 2 decades serving her country. She had led troops through some of the most dangerous combat zones, sat at negotiating tables where every word carried the weight of peace or war, and earned the respect of an entire nation. But none of that mattered when she walked into an upscale shopping mall that day. To most, she was just another customer. To one man, she was something else entirely. Dressed in a simple tracksuit and sneakers, Sarah blended effortlessly into the weekend crowd. She wasn't looking for attention. She wasn't expecting confrontation. All she wanted was a new pair of running shoes, a small indulgence in an otherwise disciplined life. She moved through the aisles of a well-known athletic store, scanning the shelves, selecting a pair she liked. It was the kind of mundane, everyday moment most of us don't think twice about. But not everyone saw it that way. Officer Troy Becket had been a cop for years. He was off duty that day, strolling through the mall like any other shopper. But old habits die hard, and Becket prided himself on being observant, on reading people. And when he saw Sarah Miller, something in his mind clicked, something dark, something dangerous. She didn't fit. Not in his eyes. Not in this place. As Sarah approached the checkout counter, she noticed something strange. Lingering glances, a hesitant cashier, the subtle stiffness in the air, as if people were waiting for something to happen. It was a feeling she had encountered before, one that crept into moments where it had no place. But she dismissed it, choosing to focus on her purchase. Outside the store, Officer Becket stood watching, hand resting near his hip, eyes locked onto Sarah. He wasn't in uniform, but his badge was visible, his pistol sitting heavy at his side. He didn't know who she was. He didn't care. To him, she looked out of place, and that was enough. Sarah stepped out of the store, bag in hand, when Becket moved in front of her. His voice was sharp, his stance firm. "Ma'am, I need to ask you a few questions." The words hung heavy in the air. A casual shopping trip had suddenly turned into something else entirely. A simple afternoon had become a confrontation. And Sarah Miller, a woman who had faced down enemies on the battlefield, now found herself staring at an unexpected threat, right here at home. But this time, the enemy wasn't a foreign force. It wasn't an opposing army. It was something much harder to fight. It was prejudice, assumption, the power of a badge in the wrong hands. And before the next few minutes were over, a gun would be drawn, a life would be changed, and the entire country would be watching. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever seen or experienced a moment where someone was unfairly judged just because of how they looked? Maybe it was subtle, a moment you brushed off. Or maybe it was something bigger, something that stuck with you. Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you believe in standing against injustice, if you believe stories like these need to be heard, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe. Let's make sure no one ever has to face a moment like this alone. Now, let's get into what happened next. The Westfield Mall hummed with the sounds of weekend shoppers, families laughing, cash registers ringing, conversations blending into an indistinct murmur. General Sarah Miller moved through the crowd with ease, dressed in a simple tracksuit and sneakers. To most, she was just another woman enjoying a casual Saturday afternoon. To Officer Troy Becket, she was a problem waiting to happen. Becket had spent years on the force, and in that time, he'd learned to trust his gut. It had saved his life more than once. But today, his instincts told him something wasn't right. He spotted her as she moved through the aisles of the upscale athletic store. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, too upright, too disciplined. Maybe it was the way others looked at her, their eyes flitting away when she met their gaze. Maybe it was just a feeling. He lingered near the entrance, pretending to scroll through his phone, but never looking away. He watched as she picked up a pair of shoes, turning them over in her hands before tucking them under her arm and heading for the register. The cashier's body language shifted, stiff smile, hesitant movements. Beckett's pulse quickened. Something was off. Miller slid her credit card across the counter, waiting as the cashier processed the transaction. She noticed Becket standing just outside the store, his gaze locked on her. It was an uneasy feeling, one she had encountered before. It was never overt, never explicit, just enough to send a message. Her purchase complete, she stepped out of the store, bag in hand. And that's when Becket made his move. He stepped directly into her path, blocking her way. "Ma'am, I need to ask you a few questions." Miller stopped, her expression calm but alert. She had faced far more dangerous situations than this, but that didn't mean she would dismiss the warning bells ringing in her head. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Becket studied her, looking for any sign of nervousness. He didn't find it. That only made him more suspicious. "You were acting suspiciously in there," he said, his hand resting near his holster. "Mind telling me what you were up to?" Miller raised an eyebrow, then lifted the shopping bag in her hand. "I was buying shoes." "That a crime?" Beckett's jaw tightened. "Let me see some ID." Miller's patience, honed through years of military service, was wearing thin. "Have I done something wrong?" Beckett's fingers flexed over his holster. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." And there it was. The shift. This wasn't about theft. This wasn't about her actions. It was about something far more insidious. Something she had seen before in boardrooms, on streets, even in uniform. It was the kind of bias that didn't need words to be understood. Miller took a deep breath, her tone even but firm. "Officer, I'm going to ask you to step back." Beckett's stance didn't change. His mind was already made up. And then he reached for his gun. The moment stretched, the mall around them falling into a hush. Mothers pulled their children close. Store clerks froze behind their counters. A single heartbeat, suspended in time. Sarah Miller, a woman who had faced down armed militants and walked through war zones, found herself staring down the barrel of a gun. Not in combat, not overseas, but in the middle of an American shopping mall. And she wasn't the only one watching. The mall fell into a stunned silence. Every sound, every movement seemed to freeze in place. Mothers instinctively clutched their children, pulling them close. Store clerks ducked behind their counters, their wide eyes peeking over displays. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken fear. And at the center of it all, standing tall, unflinching, was Major General Sarah Miller. Her gaze locked onto the gun barrel pointed directly at her chest. "Drop the bag," Becket barked, his voice sharp, his hand steady. Miller let the shopping bag slip from her fingers, the soft thud against the polished floor barely audible in the eerie silence. "Get on the ground," Becket ordered again, his tone leaving no room for argument. But Miller wasn't about to kneel. She took a slow step forward, her hands raised just enough to show she wasn't a threat, yet her posture remained resolute. "I am Major General Sarah Miller of the United States Army. Lower your weapon." For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Beckett's eyes, doubt, confusion. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. Unchecked ego, the kind that refused to back down. "Yeah, right," he sneered. "Get down or else." The tension in the air thickened. Then, from somewhere in the growing crowd, a voice sliced through the moment like a blade. "Or else what?" A young man stepped forward, phone raised, its tiny lens capturing everything. "She just told you she's a general. You're pointing a gun at a hero." Beckett's face darkened. "Get out of here," he snapped, his gun hand twitching. But it was too late. Phones went up all around them. Dozens of tiny screens reflected the same image. An armed officer, his gun trained on an unarmed woman whose only crime was existing in the wrong place, in the wrong skin. "Do you even know who you're pointing that gun at?" another voice called out. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, first hushed, then rising. The tide was turning. "That's General Miller. She fought for this country. And this is how you treat her." Beckett's grip tightened on the weapon, but his hands weren't as steady now. His face flushed under the weight of the scrutiny, the pressure mounting with each passing second. He could feel the shift in the crowd, the way the moment had slipped beyond his control. Mall security rushed in, their faces pale as they took in the scene. Two guards, breathless and wide-eyed, stepped forward, "What's going on here?" one of them demanded. Miller kept her gaze locked on Becket. Her voice, steady as steel, didn't waver. "This officer pulled a gun on me for no reason," she said. "I want to speak to his supervisor." A hush fell again. And then, a new voice emerged, firm, authoritative. "General Miller?" The crowd parted as Captain Denise Harper stepped forward. Her uniform was crisp, her presence commanding. The recognition in her eyes was immediate, her brows knitting together in a mix of shock and controlled fury. Beckett's breath hitched as Harper approached. "Holster your weapon, Officer Becket," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. He hesitated, but only for a moment. The weight of the crowd, the cameras, the undeniable truth pressing down on him, left him with no choice. His jaw tightened as he lowered his weapon, sliding it back into his holster. Harper turned to Miller, her expression sincere. "General, are you all right?" Miller nodded. "I am. But this isn't just about me." Harper exhaled, then turned back to Becket. "We'll be talking about this immediately." The damage, however, had already been done. The video spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Within hours, it was everywhere. Social media feeds flooded with clips of the incident, captions filled with outrage, disbelief, and demands for justice. News anchors replayed the footage over and over, dissecting every second, every word, every movement. It wasn't just another viral story. It was a wake-up call. People weren't just watching, they were feeling it. They saw the fear in Miller's eyes, the arrogance in Beckett's stance, the sheer injustice of it all. And it struck a nerve. Activists took to the streets. Protesters held up signs that read "Justice for all" and "End racial profiling." The noise was deafening, the energy unrelenting. Then Beckett's past came under scrutiny. People started digging. Complaints surfaced, reports of racial profiling that had been quietly dismissed, disciplinary actions that had mysteriously disappeared. The department could no longer look away. Within a week, Becket was suspended. The police chief held a press conference, his expression grim as he addressed the nation. "We take these allegations seriously," he said. "There will be a full investigation." But for many, it wasn't enough. Because this wasn't just about one officer. This was about a system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for years. A system where even a decorated general, someone who had given her life to protecting her country, could be treated as a suspect simply because of the color of her skin. Sarah Miller, for her part, remained composed through it all. She didn't lash out. She didn't call for revenge. She just spoke the truth. "This isn't just about me," she said in a televised interview, her voice calm yet firm. "This is about the thousands of people who don't have the rank, the status, or the platform to fight back. It's about the everyday people who go through this and never get justice. That has to change." Her words became a rallying cry. People quoted her in posts, in speeches, in conversations with their families at dinner tables. The momentum didn't fade, it grew. Lawsuits were filed. Politicians weighed in. Proposals for reform gained traction. A movement that had already been simmering suddenly found itself with a new face, a new story, a new undeniable proof of what so many had been saying for years. And through it all, Miller remained steadfast. She had faced battles on foreign soil, but this, she realized, was the fight that mattered most. Not for her own sake, but for the countless others who deserved to walk through their own cities, their own neighborhoods, without fear. Change was coming. Not overnight, not easily, but it was coming. And this time, the world was watching. This story isn't just about what happened that day in the mall. It's about something much bigger. It's about the reality that prejudice still exists in places where it shouldn't. It's about how a routine shopping trip turned into a moment of reckoning, not just for one person but for an entire community. It's about the power of a single voice. The young man who raised his phone and pressed record didn't just capture a video. He captured the truth. In that moment, he became more than just a bystander. He became a witness. And because of him, the world saw what happened. Because of him, the truth could not be buried, ignored, or rewritten. It's about the strangers who refused to look away, the people who stepped forward, who spoke up, who made it clear that they would not be silent in the face of injustice. They didn't have to act. They could have kept their heads down, moved on with their day. But they didn't. And that choice mattered. That choice changed everything. It's about justice. Not just for one person, but for many. This wasn't just about Sarah Miller. This was about every person who has ever been judged unfairly, who has ever felt the weight of someone else's assumptions. This was about making sure that those in power are held accountable, that no one gets to use a badge or a title as a shield for prejudice. And it's a reminder, no matter how high you rise, no matter how much you achieve, bias can still find its way into your life. But it's also a reminder that together, we can push back, we can demand better, we can hold people accountable, and we can create a world where moments like these don't happen anymore. It starts with awareness. It continues with action, and it depends on all of us. So now the question is, what will you do? So now, I turn to you. Have you ever witnessed something unfair? Have you ever seen someone judged not for what they did, but for who they are? What would you have done in that moment? What will you do the next time it happens? This story isn't just one person's experience. It's a reflection of a bigger reality, one that too many people live with every day. But it doesn't have to stay this way. Change starts when we speak up, when we refuse to look away, when we decide that silence is not an option. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Let's make sure that stories like this don't get ignored, because the more we shine a light on injustice, the harder it is to hide. And that's how change happens, one voice at a time. Now, let's hear yours. Emma sat at the small kitchen table, scrolling through news articles, her jaw tightening with every misleading headline. Logan had wasted no time spinning his story, painting himself and his gang as victims. The media had picked up his version, and now social media was ablaze with heated debates. Sophia leaned against the counter, arms crossed. We can't let this stand. We let him control the narrative. And we're done. Emma nodded, already dialing a number. Time to call in some favors. Within hours, they were on a video call with an old friend, Daniel West, a respected investigative journalist who had spent years exposing corruption. He listened as they laid out what had happened, his expression growing more serious. Logan's got connections, Daniel said, typing rapidly on his keyboard. But truth still has a way of finding its way out. Send me everything you've got. Sophia sent him the details, while Emma contacted another ally, Rachel Carter, a social media strategist who knew how to turn public opinion. We need to get ahead of this, Emma told her. We need people to see the real story. Rachel didn't hesitate. I'll get the right voices on this. But we need hard proof. That's when the break came. The diner's owner, frustrated with how things were being spun, handed over the full security footage from that night. It was exactly what they needed. The video showed everything, Logan and his gang initiating the confrontation, their aggression, and the moment Emma and Sophia had defended themselves. Rachel wasted no time. She edited the footage, adding captions to clarify key moments. The video went live on multiple platforms with the title, The Truth About Logan Harrington. Who's the real aggressor? Within minutes, it started gaining traction. The first wave of responses was outrage. People who had originally believed Logan's story now saw the truth unfold before their eyes. The comment sections exploded. I can't believe the media ran with his version. This changes everything. Those women were defending themselves. How many times has Logan done this before and gotten away with it? As the video gained millions of views, news outlets that had initially framed Emma and Sophia as the aggressors scrambled to reassess their stance. Daniel published an in-depth piece exposing Logan's history, his prior arrests, his intimidation tactics, and his deep ties to local corruption. Other journalists followed, some even issuing retractions to their initial reports. Logan's world began to crumble. The once feared leader of the biker gang was now the subject of scrutiny. His supporters began to waver, distancing themselves as the evidence stacked against him. Even within his own ranks, cracks were forming. The loyalty he once commanded was faltering. In the heart of the storm, Logan sat in his dimly lit clubhouse, his phone buzzing nonstop with messages from furious allies and reporters demanding comments. His fists clenched as he watched the video play out on the screen before him. He could see it, his carefully crafted facade unraveling in real time. We need to fix this, one of his men muttered. Fast. Logan exhaled sharply, standing up. No. We need to make them regret this. Meanwhile, Emma and Sophia were watching everything unfold from their apartment. The tide was turning, but they knew it wasn't over. He won't go down without a fight, Sophia murmured, sipping her coffee. Emma nodded. Then we make sure he has nowhere left to run.